Okay. Okay. Welcome all to this symposium organized by the Icelandic section of Amnesty International, Intersex Ísland, and Samtökin 78, the national queer organization, and the Icelandic Human Rights Center here in Iceland. My name is Anna Lúðvíksdóttir. I am the director of Amnesty International here in Iceland. And I will be chairing this meeting as Margrét Steinarsdóttir, who was supposed to be here, unfortunately fell sick, so she cannot be here with us today. I want to introduce our guests. First, I will introduce the panel here that is sitting here with us in the beginning of the program. We have here Kitty Andersson, the Icelandic Intersex campaigner and chairperson of the Intersex Ísland. Welcome, Kitty. She's also in the board of OII Europe, which is like a European umbrella organization for intersex people. And she is the co-chair, acting co-chair in the organization OII. As well, I would like to introduce María Helga Guðmundsdóttir. She is the chairperson of Samtökin 78, and Kristín María Björnsdóttir, the secretary of Intersex in Iceland. Welcome all. Before I welcome them to have their talk, I would just like to open this session with a small introduction. For decades, Amnesty International pillars of work has been the fight against discrimination and violence in law and practice against marginalized individuals and groups, including people who have faced historical discrimination on the basis of their sexual orientation and gender identity. It was in the year 2013 that Amnesty framed its policy of intersex issues, but the organization really started proactively to work on the rights of intersex people in 2015. And with the great help of our outspoken Icelandic Intersex campaigner and the chairperson of the Intersex Ísland, Kitty Andersson, Amnesty launched its first report on human rights violations experienced by children and adults with variations of sex characteristics in Denmark and Germany. The report, named First Do No Harm, was published in May 2017, and one of our distinguished guests here today, Laura Carter, a researcher and policy advisor on sexual orientation and gender identity at Amnesty International Secretariat, was the lead researcher on the report. We live in interesting times. Information on everything is everywhere around us, only one click away. Yet we can go through life without knowing what is really going on in the society, without knowing the challenges the people next to us have to overcome, not knowing what human rights abuses the people around us in our own culture face, let alone in countries far away. Since the 1990s, more and more people with variation of sex characteristics who have undergone medical interventions began to speak out about their experiences. Many highlighted their opposing of normalizing medical treatment and promoted the use of the term intersex. Since then, organizations, activist groups, human rights defenders, and support groups have worked hard to bring visibility to these issues. This advocacy and awareness work has led to intersex rights issues being incorporated in a declaration by 12 United Nations agencies, calling on states to end violence and discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people, and highlighting the practice of unnecessary surgery and treatment on intersex children without their consent. This is the first time that so many members of the United Nations family have joined forces in defense of the basic rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender and intersex people. It's an expression of commitment, and the statement highlights the link between human rights abuses against LGBTI people and ill health, family breakup, social and economic exclusion, and lost opportunities for development and economical growth. It sets out specific steps that governments, in particular, should take to curb violence and protect individuals from discrimination. Yes, things may have moved forward thanks to the untiring work of intersex and other LGBT activists, but for too long has the issue of intersex people been hidden, ignored, and not discussed among the general public. Within the medical profession in many countries has secrecy been the custom, and intersex people have been advised not to discuss their diversity. In years past, people's own diverse characteristics have even been kept secret from them, sometimes them only finding out by chance later on in life, and then have had to struggle to access their own medical reports or get thorough information on what kind of treatment or surgery they have endured in their life. The issue of intersex people face are children's rights issue. It's also about health and reproductive rights, as when unnecessary surgeries are performed without consent or adequate information, they violate people's right to physical bodily integrity and may have long-term consequences on their right to health and their sexual and reproductive rights, particularly since it can infect people's fertility. And we see a light of hope and changes. In 2015, Malta became the first country to forbid medical professionals from carrying out unnecessary surgical interventions on intersex infants. And other countries like Belgium, Greece, and Norway have started to take some steps in the right direction. This veil of silence has also begun to fall away here in Iceland. However, in parallel with increasing international awareness, United Nations committees have issued directives to many of the countries with which we compare ourselves, pointing out that current practices in the treatment of intersex children violate the UN Conventions on the Right of the Child and against torture and other cruel and degrading inhuman treatment or punishment. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe has also issued a resolution calling on member states, and Iceland included, to adequately guarantee intersex people's human rights and bodily integrity. Amnesty International is pushing the government to act in collaboration with medical staff to create guidelines respecting the human rights of intersex people. Unnecessary medical practices which subject children to painful and often damaging surgeries for them to fit within the binary male and female cannot be allowed to continue unchallenged. Intersex people, like everyone else, should have the right to make informed decisions about their own bodies. So Icelandic authorities have work to do. They need to ensure the basic rights of intersex people and lead Iceland into having the most comprehensive and respectful laws when it comes to the right of intersex people. Their time is now. The Icelandic section of Amnesty International started its collaboration with Samtökin 78 and Intersex Ísland last year in the pursuit of uniting in the fight to ensure that human rights of intersex people are protected and respected to the highest in Iceland as everywhere else. This symposium is the first step in our collaborated effort to make Iceland a global leader of the effort on this issue. So, without further ado, I would like to kindly welcome our guest speakers and all of you who are attended here today. And when they have finished their speech, we will have short time for questions that are directly related to their speech. And then at the end of the program today, we can have more time to discuss the whole, what has been spoken about here today and the whole issue. So, welcome you all.
By the head pediatric endocrinologist of the National Children's Hospital and stated that moving away from the current practice was dangerous experimentation. Well, if we look at the real issue, the real situation, the majority of the medical interventions that are performed have no research to back them up. They started as experimentation in the 90s and 50s, in the 1950s and 60s, and then became entrenched as practice, because apparently in the 50s and 60s, society was not very accepting of people with any form of difference. The second mention of intersex issues in Icelandic media was in 2013, where again the chief pediatric endocrinologist of the National Children's Hospital stated that there were between 0 and 3 children born here every year whose sex could not be determined. And that of course all of these children would be scheduled for surgery as soon as possible to normalize their appearance. That this was just what needed to be done for these children. In 2014, a group of us founded Intersex Ísland because we were tired of hearing nothing about our rights in the Icelandic context. When we wanted to seek someone to speak to, we had to leave the country. The first time we left the country was in 2004, and then we left again in 2012, just to find someone to speak to. We founded Intersex Ísland summer of 2014 on Stonewall Day, a historic day here in Iceland when it comes to LGBT rights, because it's a date that has often been used to enact legislation that pertains to queer people's issues. We found it fitting. We started raising awareness about the human rights violations that intersex people across Europe and across the world face. We started raising awareness about what the situation was here in Iceland. We then managed to sort of get discussions with parliamentary parties and individual members of parliament. And we asked them to see if they could get information that we could not access. Information about how many procedures and interventions were actually taking place here. The Minister of Health posed this question. He went to the National Hospital and asked for figures, for statistics, and was given the answer that 3 such children had been born in Iceland in the last 10 years. So we see a sudden shift from 0 to 3 a year to 3 in a decade. In the time span between that first interview in the end of 2013 and the parliamentary question being posed in spring 2015. We have then engaged with Icelandic medical professionals who deal with this issue. And while we are very clear that we are fighting for the rights of all people who are born with variations of sex characteristics, they were also very clear that intersex people didn't really exist. There were only a handful in the last 10 years, and that most of the people that we were discussing would definitely not fall under the umbrella of intersex. During one meeting, I sat in front of a doctor and listened to him explain why my biology could not be considered intersex. It's become very clear through our repeated discussions that they only believe that people who are born with genitalia that cannot be classified as either male or female, and do not fall under certain diagnostic terms, could be classified as intersex. And they also seem very confused in the fact that intersex doesn't mean you're not a man. Intersex does not mean that you are not a woman. Intersex just means that your biology is a little bit different than most men and most women. Of course, there are intersex people who also identify outside the binary, but that is how they identify. That is not how their particular biological parts sort of came together. We have been noticing increased resistance towards connecting intersex from the medical community about connecting intersex issues to the LGBTI. They say that these are completely separate issues, that they should not be discussed together. Doctors here in Iceland have even written articles in the newspaper telling us how confused we are for confusing these two very different issues. We agree. Intersex people and trans people face very different life experiences. Intersex people and trans people need different legislative measures to protect them. But we also share similarities. We often need to deal with a medical system that is not open to what we have to say. If we become public about ourselves, either as trans people or intersex people, we fear stigma. We fear that we will be discriminated against just for who we are. And why do intersex issues connect to LGB? Because the start of the current treatment paradigm started because of medical professionals' fear that if they did not normalize us, that we would turn out to be gay or lesbian, that we wouldn't agree with the gender that we had been assigned at birth, that we would exhibit behaviors that were not typical for the gender we were assigned at birth. And the current treatment paradigm starts in the 1950s and 1960s, full force. And if we look at what LGBT people and LGBT people were being subjected to within the medical field, we see the same practices against us all. Normalization, making us perfect men or women with the correct sexual orientation who fit into society. Because during these years, lesbians and gay people, bisexual people and trans people were being lobotomized in hospitals in the Western world. They were subjected to electrical shock, torture, to change their sexual orientation or gender identity. Today, we call this conversion therapy. And conversion therapy is exactly what intersex people are being subjected to. Converting our bodies to fit into an ideal standard. But this ideal standard does not exist. There is no correct way to be a man. There is no correct way to be a woman. And there is no correct way to be a non-binary person. Through the last few years, we have been contacted by many intersex people, but they do not want to come out. They fear discrimination in the workplace, they fear discrimination in their schools. They fear discrimination in their social groups. But we have done what little we can to try to help them. Often this just means being a voice on the other side of a phone line, somebody to talk to. What we have done the most of, however, is helping intersex people obtain their medical records. Well, we haven't been very successful. We found that here in Iceland, obtaining a complete set of medical records for intersex people is extremely hard. We see that medical records from sort of older times, from hospitals that are no longer operating anymore, are almost impossible to hunt down. We find that when people actually get their medical records, that the information that was written down in them is not accurate and doesn't reflect what happened to these people. We also find that often these records don't exist. They've been lost. I myself spent over 12 months hunting down my medical records. And they do not cover everything that happened to me. Within our board, we have a young board member who still hasn't been able to get all of her medical records. So combine this with not being able to access your medical records not being complete, and the fact that doctors will not tell you that there are a lot of other people out there who might not share your exact biology, but do share comparable experiences, then it's often very hard for people to fully know if they are intersex or not, if they have a variation of sex characteristics or not. So we get a lot of questions about, well, I have this experience and this experience and this experience. Does this mean I'm intersex? And we say, well, that sounds like an intersex experience to us, but intersex experiences are varied, so for a lot of people, they might not want to join forces with us because they aren't quite sure. They can't get the information that they would need to be certain that they belong under this umbrella. So, yes, access to information, gatekeeping of information is a huge issue here in Iceland. But we also have people who have come to us who have some maybe shared this with one person. It's been sort of spread around in a community. And they found that when they've asked to see who has accessed their medical records, that there's a ridiculous amount of people looking into their private information.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oops. Okay. I'm not good with technology either, so let me know if it's not working. 1982, I gave a birth to a beautiful, healthy baby girl in hospital in Reykjavík. I took the baby home, but few weeks later, it was discovered that she had a hernia, common with young babies. And an operation was scheduled. I was told that the operation wouldn't take long. But after waiting 3 hours in the hospital for the operation to finish, I started to get a little bit anxious. But nobody seemed to know anything. And when I asked the hospital staff why it was taking so long, they just said, we don't know. It should be finished. When I finally got my baby back, and I asked, they said operation was fine, and I didn't really get any answers, and me being very relieved, having my baby back and the operation went well, I asked no more questions. I had a very strange meeting with a surgeon that operated on her before we were discharged, but I just put it down to bad people skills. The only thing he said was the operation went well, that the stitches would dissolve, and I didn't need to bring her in for any further checkups. So I just took her home. The stitches did not dissolve. The wound got infected, and I spent a lot of time in the children's ward getting help with this. During those visits, I started to get some strange feelings that something was wrong, because I could feel the some kind of vibes from the staff. And finally, one doctor sat me down and told me that my baby had a very, very rare chromosomal disorder. They did not really know very much about this, but they were expecting a specialist, a doctor that had been specializing in the USA, and he was on his way back to Iceland, and he would explain everything when he arrived within a few weeks. I went home and waited. Finally, the doctor came, and as kindly as he could, he explained this so-called chromosomal disorder. He told me that she had undeveloped gonads that would need to be removed due to cancer risk. And of course, when a parent hears the cancer word, everyone goes sort of in a shock. And they advised to do it before the age of 2, because then she wouldn't remember and wouldn't ask questions. He stressed at all times that she was a girl in every respect. She would get a hormonal treatment to help her through puberty, and could live a healthy life with a hormonal treatment, and the only thing she could not do was to give birth to a child. But he also stressed very strongly that I should keep this a secret. Not to tell my daughter until she started her hormonal replacement therapy, as the information would be too much for her, and she wouldn't be able to keep the secret while she was so young. He also stressed that I should not share this information with anyone, not even my closest family. Not with my parents, not with my sisters, no one. Thankfully, I ignored that advice regarding my family. My daughter had a recurring hernia at 3 months. She had another operation, and during that, the so-called undeveloped gonads were removed. Years later, in 2004, when we went to a meeting in a support group in Britain, we found out that what was removed were functional testes that would have given her all the hormones to lead a healthy life, and the cancer risk scare was based on researches that had nothing to do with her condition. I also found out that the statement of my baby living a healthy life with substitute hormones were not true. So the operation that I had allowed in the belief that it would be the only choice to secure a healthy life for my daughter actually ruined her health. On top of that, I had kept this a secret from my daughter. And when I told her, finally, when she was starting her hormonal treatment, her trust in me was completely broken. And I learned that secrecy is the mother of shame. I'm not saying that the health professions were doing this out of anything, but with the best intentions at the time. But 1996, when my niece was born, with the same condition as my daughter, the same procedure started all those years later. Nothing had changed. Operation at an early age was performed. No problem, they said. Artificial hormone treatment would ensure healthy living. And they also told them, at that time, she was just a baby, a few months old, that she would need further surgery to get a vaginal plasticity to enlarge, she had a short vagina. She was a baby. Fortunately, at that time, we knew. We had the information that this was not necessary. At that time, a change had started in the treatments of children with this condition. And the advice was to leave the removal of the testes, or what was always referred to as undeveloped gonads. Never mention the word testes until after puberty. If they had followed those new ways of treatment, then we would have had the knowledge that when my niece reached puberty, by the time she had reached puberty, if they had left her untouched, at that time we knew that there was no need for these surgeries. And then it would not have been performed. We as a family had at least learned from our mistake, or my mistake, in keeping secrets. That's not a good idea. And my niece knew from a very young age that she was intersex. We went to another support group in the UK in 2012. The only way to get any support was to go abroad. At that meeting, we spoke to a doctor from the University College London Hospital, and we got information that the health problems both my daughter and niece were having were due to early medical intervention and mismanagement of hormonal treatments. When we started to ask questions and criticize the medical care, we hit a brick wall. We hit a brick wall with the so-called specialist in this field, the endocrinologists. And at that time, there were no good intentions or compassion. Finally, in 2015, we complained to the Directorate of Health, Landlæknisembættið, just to get a doctor assigned to my niece, as at the age of 18, she had been diagnosed with osteopenia. It took nearly a year for us to get an appointment for her with this assigned specialist. We are still fighting for better healthcare, but we are also fighting for the future of intersex children. I, as a parent, made choices that should not have been mine to make. And most definitely, they should not have been the doctors to make. I firmly believe today that the intersex individuals should be the only ones allowed to make choices regarding their own body. There must be an end to unnecessary medical treatment and surgery of intersex children without their consent. We as a parent, we should not have the right to give this consent for our children.
I'd like to thank my fellow panelists for sharing their knowledge and for sharing their very, very personal experiences. I myself do not have a personal connection to this issue the same way that they do, but I come to it as a representative of the National Queer Organization of Iceland, and so my perspective is very much that of taking intersex issues in the context of the wider struggle for rights for LGBTIQ people. And so the title of this panel is Past and Current Practice, Current Legal Standards in Iceland. We've touched very little on legal standards so far, for good reason. There are none. Intersex people, people with variations in their sex characteristics, merit no mention in current Icelandic law whatsoever. They are not protected under any anti-discrimination legislation in Iceland. Icelandic anti-discrimination and equality legislation is very limited, so that's perhaps not surprising, but it is nevertheless a very serious problem. And there are no legal safeguards to protect intersex people's bodily autonomy, their right to make decisions about their own bodies. Never mind any sort of protections for intersex children who systematically have decisions with devastating consequences taken for them in infancy. And these are very serious issues that we need to work to address. Compounding this is the fact that there is no, or that the window for any sort of redress due to human rights violations that occur in medical treatment is limited by a 10-year statute of limitations. When you have surgery performed on you at 3 months, it's pretty unlikely that if you you probably haven't even reached puberty by the time that the statute of limitations has expired. So your opportunity to seek any sort of redress for the violations that you have suffered is, in practice, none. And all of these are very serious concerns that that we need to work on immediately, yesterday, the day before yesterday, preferably. Such work is taking place, and it's a cause for great optimism that the current governing coalition refers explicitly in its agreement to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe's resolution on the rights of intersex people, and that the governing coalition has expressed its will to advance intersex human rights through legislation. And so we consider this to be great cause for optimism, but those are still just words on paper. Those are intentions, they're not laws. And so now is, I think, a very critical moment in Iceland to advance real concrete steps to address the rights of intersex people. And I'd also like to refer back to what Kitty was describing earlier about, well, this question that sometimes arises of, like, why do intersex people belong within the the LGBT framework that we are so used to thinking of and sort of stopping after the T and calling it a day. And at a fundamental level, the reason that people are discriminated against for having a sexual orientation or a gender identity or gender expression or sex characteristics that fall outside the expected norms is because our society is structured along very rigid lines of a gender binary where certain characteristics are expected and certain behaviors and ways of being are expected of those who are expected to be men, and a different set of characteristics and behaviors is expected of those who are expected to be women. And people who dare to color outside the lines with their bodies, with their ways of being, with their ways of interacting with others, with whom they love, with whom they choose to have sex with, etc., are frequently and often violently forced back into those frames, or attempts are made to force them back into those frames. And that, to me, is the fundamental commonality in our struggle and the reason that we are in this together.
Okay. Within the Icelandic context, we have had sort of, I'd say, almost convinced ourselves that things had gotten better since 15 years ago. Until we read an article in an Icelandic newspaper about a very young mother who had given birth to a child with variations in their sex characteristics. She was sent home without any information whatsoever. She was just told, well, we don't know if your child is a boy or a girl. She was sent home and left alone for 9 months. She was promised trauma support, counseling, áfallahjálp. But she was just sent home, left alone for 9 months. And then she was told, well, we figured it out. Your son is a boy. Your child is a boy. Your child is your son. And the last we heard, that child was slated and scheduled for surgical intervention. So
And
this
not
is
just
happening,
once.
and not just once.
Multiple surgical interventions before the age of 5.
Was stated in the interview. So this is what's happening in Iceland today.
It's 1 o'clock now, which is when the panel is going to end, so I don't know how
Thank
long.
you so much for your very interesting. Yes, I want to thank you so much for your interesting and touching speech from all of you. Sorry? Here. Okay. And I will give a few minutes if you have some specific questions from the audience to any of them, and then we will continue again at the end. We will have time for questions to everybody.
Yes, I'd like to ask, is there any hope that there will be an education for doctors, letters, please?
Education of legislators has been ongoing and going quite well. Education of doctors will need intervention with someone who has a higher authority than us as activists do. We have tried to engage, but it's very difficult.
On the other hand, I do think there's some hope to be placed in generational change within that profession, as with all professions. We find that conversations with students in medical professions are often easier to open, and as most of us are when we're young and still sort of shaping our ideas about how to do things and how to view the world. Medical students, both student doctors and nurses, are often quite receptive to these sort of newer ways of looking at things. So there's some hope.
So 34 years.
Yeah, and
We're not going to wait that long.
that's the issue with relying on just educating students. It will take them 15, 20, 30 years until they are in a position where they can make the decisions.
And also I saw an interview with a sympathetic doctor, and he says what needs to be changed is the text, what they learn in school. And the teachers are old-fashioned, so it's hard to change. But
within education here in Iceland, and this sort of leads to, I think, the stigmatization. Until 2015, Icelandic schools were teaching that the correct translation of intersex was the Icelandic word viðrinni. When you translate viðrinni back to English, it's translated as freak. When you look at the dictionary definition of this word, it says a senseless being, a two-sexed creature, something that is so pitiful that it is neither fish nor fowl. So until, 2015, when we had the Icelandic dictionaries changed, this was the dictionary definition of intersex in Iceland.
Yeah. The queer community has done a lot of reclamation of words that have stigma attached to them, but this is one I think it's not worth even trying. Yeah. It's for those who are non-speakers of Icelandic, like this word is like one of the most profoundly negative words I've heard applied to any human being. So.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Laura Messon from the Norwegian government. I have a question when it comes to the interaction between organizations that use the intersex term, LGBT organizations or intersex organizations or human rights organizations, and patient organizations that, at least in the Norwegian context, don't use the intersex term, and also have huge difficulties with this term being used about them. So
Yeah.
I was wondering how it is in Icelandic context, or whether there are any alliance between these.
So in Iceland, we don't really have patient organizations that are at least accessible, that there is any information about. So they don't really exist. When it comes to terminology, intersex is a good word in English. There is a reason we have chosen not to translate this word, and we instead use in Icelandic the descriptive term ódæmigerð kyneinkenni. This would translate to non-normative sex characteristics. Ódæmigerð can also translate to atypical, but so basically our translation of the term variations of sex characteristics, because the word intersex can't necessarily be translated in a good way into every language. Even the terminology variations of sex characteristics translated that way into Icelandic, because the translation of variation is frávik. If you translate that back to English, it means abnormal or abhorrent. It's a very stigmatizing word. Whereas in English, a lot of people find that the term atypical is more stigmatizing, whereas in Icelandic, it's not as stigmatizing as the word variation. So respecting the language choices of the people in each country is important, but finding an umbrella term that all people with variations of sex characteristics can agree to is an important step forward, because translating the word intersex into Norwegian directly would be like interkjön, and that would imply that this person is not a man or a woman. And for people who have questioned or been sort of suggested to them that they are not man or woman enough, then that can be stigmatizing. So yeah, we use intersex in English because there is a clear distinction between sex and gender, which is lacking in the majority of the European languages.
Okay, thank you so much. We will have time again to ask them direct questions at the end of the session, so thank you very much.